Board here so that folks that are not able to join us live will have access to this content. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Ward. I'm the Director of Planning here at Texas Homeless Network. If you came to learn more about the Continuum of Care program and the Texas Balance of State, you are in the right place. If none of that makes sense, stick around for a minute and we'll help you figure out if this is where you want to be. So I am going to go ahead and click us through these slides. I wanted to take a second and introduce everyone on the team. So again, my name is Jim Ward. I am the Director of Planning here at THN. And I'll hand it over to the team to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. My name is Billy Strew. I am the Planning and Engagement Coordinator at Texas Homeless Network, which means I provide support for a lot of the organizations that are in the southern part of Texas.
And I'm Dusty Whirl. I'm the Planning and Policy Coordinator. I will be working with mostly people in northern Texas.
Hey, good morning, y'all. I'm Hope Rogers. I use she, her pronouns. I am not on this slide intentionally, and that's because I've recently transitioned from the planning team to the systems change team, and have been running our CoC local application process for the past 2 years, and will be supporting that process in my new role as Director of Systems Change. So please consider the folks on this slide your primary points of contact for the competition this year.
We're definitely still grateful for Hope's presence in this space because we really couldn't do it without her. So in terms of what we're hoping to accomplish today.
Jim?
Yes.
Can we pause real quick? Is anyone else having trouble seeing the slides? We got a message that someone was having an issue seeing the screen share. Okay, I see some folks can see it. Amanda, you may want to try logging off and then logging back in.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Hope. So just in terms of like a basic overview of what we're hoping to accomplish today, there is a fair amount of content that we're hoping to get through, as well as leaving some time for question and answers. But essentially, we're hoping folks will leave this with a basic understanding of the continuum of care and the continuum of care program. A basic understanding of this CoC program competition you've probably heard buzzing around for the last couple of weeks, how to submit an application for CoC program funding, and then next steps for applicants and next steps in the process. And then, as I mentioned, leaving a little bit of time for questions and answers. So in terms of what a continuum of care is, and I apologize, I know we have some seasoned vets in this room that are very familiar with the continuum of care, but I also recognize that we have folks that may not, know. And at its core, a CoC is a group recognized by HUD to carry out the responsibilities required under the continuum of care program for a specific geographic area. In true HUD fashion, the CoC has about 4 different definitions. You might hear it referred to, and people would be talking about that group of agencies working together, planning to address homelessness. Could also be talking about the geographic area associated with that planning group. And then what we're going to spend our time talking about today is the program operated by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for the stated purpose of helping communities in homelessness. So there are 11 continuums of care in Texas today. Of the 11, the Texas Balance of State is by far the largest. We cover approximately 215 counties of Texas's 254, which works out to approximately 84% of the state's landmass. But you can see on this slide that there are 10 other CoCs, right? So if you're joining us, I think I saw someone from Fort Worth. Fort Worth has its own local continuum of care and its own local process. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But just recognize that we are one of 11, right? We're not the end all be all for continuum of care program funding in the state of Texas. If you're joining from a metropolitan area that's reflected on this slide in one of the other colors, it's very likely that you will need to apply to that local process, and we can help connect you to that group if that's necessary. So HUD's CoC program, the purpose is really to help communities align their efforts, promote the effective use of mainstream resources, promote community commitment around ending homelessness. Of course, I think obviously providing funding for communities to rehouse people experiencing homelessness while minimizing the trauma of that experience. And then, the final kind of big bucket goal of the continuum of care program is to optimize self-sufficiency, right? So we want folks to be able to return to a sense of normalcy after this very traumatic experience of experiencing housing instability, and at some point no longer need assistance from nonprofits or other providers. So Texas Homeless Network and the CoC. Let's talk about that because this is one that gets kind of conflated frequently. So Texas Homeless Network is a statewide agency. We do statewide policy and advocacy on behalf of the entire state of Texas at the state capitol. That's another department. The folks that you're talking to today don't do that. We are instead what HUD would consider to be the collaborative applicant for the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. So that means we run this local competition process. We host or facilitate an annual point in time count. We submit reports to HUD on behalf of those 215 counties. We are also the HMIS lead for the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. So that means that we operate our homeless management information system that is used in that orange CoC on the prior slide. Every CoC has its own collaborative applicant and its own HMIS system. So I think that's really important to understand if you're, kind of joining this space and maybe don't have a ton of points of reference for how this all works. And as I mentioned, we cover a significant portion of the state's landmass. And one of the primary responsibilities that we'll be talking about today is facilitation of the application process for CoC program funding in a given geographic area. I realized that as I just kind of like jumped into the content, I did not invite people to, share or ask questions in the chat. So if you have questions about the content, please ask them in the chat so that we can make sure to hit them, either stop the presentation and address them, right then and there, or during the Q&A session. Yes, the Continuum of Care program. And I think I'm going to pass it over to Billy to talk more about what the CoC application looks like.
Yeah, so before we dig into the details of this massive kind of project and application process that you're considering or are being a part of, I like to just zoom out and kind of take a bird's eye view. I don't know if it's helpful for you, but for me, it's helpful to liken this whole process to a jigsaw puzzle, to where it kind of feels like when you're putting, it might feel like you just dumped all the pieces out on the table and it just doesn't feel like there's any organization whatsoever. But for me, whenever you're looking at the whole puzzle being what we would call the consolidated application, you would notice that there'd be sections of the puzzle that are put together. So I'm going to discuss with you real quick 3 sections of this jigsaw puzzle that we're calling the consolidated application. And so one section of the puzzle we call the CoC application. This is the part that Texas Homeless Network is completing. We submit this part of the application on behalf of the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. And the CoC application contains a whole lot of questions, a whole lot of narrative questions, as well as chart questions where we're having to provide all kinds of details about how the continuum of care works and what the continuum of care is doing. And you'll see through these sections of the puzzle, or these different parts of the consolidated application, because we are all the continuum of care. And so it's important for us to be transparent in the process and provide opportunities for stakeholders, which is you, to be able to be a part of the process, to be able to see the materials before they're submitted and provide feedback, and if that is what you care to do in the process. And so prior to us submitting the CoC application, we do post this online prior to that submission to allow for the stakeholders to review and provide feedback if they wish to do so. The priority listing is what we put together after all of the individual applications are submitted. We will rank them according to our scoring criteria, which we'll discuss later in this presentation. And then we will rank all of the applications into this priority listing that will be provided to and submitted along in this consolidated application. And as I mentioned earlier, this is approved by the CoC board, and then we do post this online prior to submission for stakeholder review and feedback. And then the third section of this puzzle is the individual project applications, which the agencies that are interested in applying for the CoC funds or are renewing existing projects for continuing CoC funds will submit these individual project applications. There are materials that you'll submit that the project applicants submit into eSnaps, and that's one part of the individual project applications that is submitted. eSnaps is HUD's grant management platform, but then also there are materials that will be submitted by the project applicants in the Texas Balance of State Continuing Care Grant Management Platform, which is SurveyMonkey Apply. So all three of those sections of this puzzle are what we would call the consolidated application. All right, next slide, please. And so kind of looking at the competition process and looking kind of at, we'll look at a more detailed timeline here in a little bit, but just kind of a general overview of the entire local application process. And not just local, but the entire CoC competition process is that we teaching staff drafts the RFP application and evaluation, and the CoC board approves the process. That is a step that has already been completed, leading us to the second step there, which is what we're in now, is that we have posted the materials, and then we'll provide technical assistance, answering questions, helping people go through the process. You know, we will sometimes be limited in how much we can answer through the technical assistance, as to prevent us from providing any unfair advantage to any particular agency. Will be available to answer, you know, objective technical assistance to be able to help people go through the process. Applications are submitted in this part of the process, which will then lead us to the individual review team, which is a team that is recruited of stakeholders across the balance of state continuum of care who are not on THN staff, that will review and score new applications. And then THN staff, we have a scorecard where we're able to use data from HMIS to score renewal projects. And then through that, after that scoring process, we will rank the projects using those scores. And then in the last step of the process, the CoC board will approve the entire application package, all three of those sections that we just discussed. And then the THN staff will submit the consolidated application to HUD.
So the fiscal year 2024-2025 CoC program competition, HUD released the NOFO on 7/31 this year. THN, then we released the local competition RFP yesterday on 8/12, and then the deadline for the CoC's response to the NOFO is on 10/30 this year. HUD has moved from a 1-year NOFO to a 2-year NOFO. And then THN will solicit all application materials for the local application via the SurveyMonkey Apply. Applicants need to be ensured they also submit an application through eSnaps, which is HUD's grant management software. Next slide, please. So the changes to the 2024-2025 NOFO. So HUD will fund renewal projects that fall within Tier 1 at 90%, which is different than last year, which was at 95%. So it's going to be a little bit more competitive. This is a 2-year NOFO, meaning that instead of doing this every year, we're only going to be doing it for renewal projects this time, and then they'll use their new sorry, their current application for the 25 year. This application also uses the fiscal year 2024 FMR, which will come out after the application has ended. And then there's also a COLA increase in supportive services budget line. This is to be determined, and this will be an automatic process after submissions have been completed. Next slide, please. So the primary funded interventions in the CoC program, so these are the rapid rehousing, which is short to medium term housing subsidiaries with wraparound services and holistic case management. These individuals are in categories 1 and category 4 of homelessness. So category 1 is literal homelessness. They're staying in places not meant for habitation. And then category 4 are individuals or families actively fleeing domestic violence. Permanent supportive housing is non-time limited housing subsidiaries with wraparound services, as well as case management for individuals and families experiencing chronic homelessness. And then finally, joint component transitional housing and rapid rehousing. This combines both transitional housing and rapid rehousing components into one project. The key here is if you request, it's a 2-to-1 ratio. So if you request $50,000 for transitional housing, you'll need to request $100,000 in rapid rehousing. Next slide. And then I'm passing it over to Hope.
Thanks, Dusty. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what the CoC program will fund. This is not intended to be an exhaustive or comprehensive list of eligible activities. I would strongly encourage you to review the RFP and request for proposals, as well as the NOFO and some other supplemental links that are linked at the end of this presentation to better understand what's eligible. But I'm just going to kind of be broadly speaking about what the program will fund. So in general, the program will fund tenant-based rental assistance. Generally speaking, this is a housing subsidy tied to an individual or family, not the unit. So the assistance follows the person, regardless of the unit that they are housed in. In this model, the lease is in the name of the client, so the client is actively building rental history while being enrolled in the project. And then the client pays a portion of the rent directly to the landlord if they have income, but income is not a requirement and should not be a barrier to entry. And then the project pays the remainder of the rent to the landlord. In a rental assistance based model, rental assistance cost can exceed fair market rent or FMR as long as the rent of the unit is reasonable in relation to other comparable units in the same area. However, keep in mind that your rental assistance budget is based on FMR or fair market rent for your area. Additionally, all units supported with the CoC program have to meet some minimum requirements in addition to rent reasonableness. They also have to meet HUD's habitability standards. This is really similar to the housing choice voucher inspection process. These standards are relatively basic, so essentially the unit has to be safe and free of any hazards, as well as has basic requirements like working windows and locks and on doors and windows, working heating and plumbing, and other basic standards of living for agencies to be able to expend CoC program dollars on those units. All housing subsidies need to be tied to supportive services as well. So there are some specific requirements in our RFP about the kind of minimum and maximum ratios to consider when building your supportive services budget. But the supportive services budget line item funds a range of activities. Generally, the bulk of this line is associated with any holistic or housing case management cost. This line will also fund like mainstream benefit benefits assistance if you plan on using a SOAR worker in connection to your project. And SOAR stands for SSI, SSDI, Outreach, Access, and Recovery. It's a model that connects folks experiencing homelessness to mainstream benefits. That is eligible under this line, as well as a broad range of activities like mental health and healthcare, outpatient substance use and treatment, and educational and vocational training. Again, I would highly encourage you to read the regulations to better understand what you can apply for under this line. And it looks like Craig put a SOAR link in the chat. Thank you. Additionally, this program will also fund costs associated with using the Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS. If you are a victim service provider and use an HMIS comparable database, those costs are also eligible under this line. So this includes things like the cost of using HMIS, so those license and access fees, as well as personnel costs related to data entry and data evaluation and ongoing reporting. And then in the past 2 years, HUD has introduced 2 new eligible budget line items, and those are the VAWA and the rural budget line items. So VAWA stands for the Violence Against Women Act, which was reauthorized in 2022. In relation to that reauthorization, HUD introduced some new costs that are eligible under this program related to VAWA compliance. One thing I want to stress here is you do not need to be a victim service provider to request costs associated with VAWA compliance. All projects, regardless of their population type, are expected to be in compliance with the standards outlined in the VAWA Reauthorization Act. I'm going to share a link in the chat about that will walk folks through a little bit more what this line will cover. But activities such as like evaluating your project's compliance with VAWA, as well as training staff on VAWA, in addition to costs associated with any kind of emergency transfers related to an episode of domestic violence while enrolled in the project. Additionally, like I mentioned, HUD has also introduced a new rural cost category. This is funds a pretty limited range of activities for folks that are serving an area that HUD has defined as rural. I will say that HUD has a more specific and stringent definition of rural than what most folks might have. So it is highly possible that your community may see itself as rural and may meet all definitions of rural, but may not be eligible for the rural category per HUD's definition. So if you enter any geocodes or geographic codes that HUD has identified as rural as part of your application, you will be able to request rural cost. And one thing I want to stress here is if you are serving both communities that HUD has defined as rural, as well as other communities that are not rural, those costs can only be used on the geographic areas that meet that definition of rural. So those costs can't be broadly applied to your whole program if you're serving a mix of rural and non-rural communities by HUD's definition. But this is a pretty cool budget line item, in my opinion, given that it serves, can fund like emergency lodging in rural communities that may not have immediate access to emergency shelter or those other kind of emerging needs for folks experiencing a housing crisis. And then lastly, administrative cost up to 10% of your total budget request, excluding match. These are costs related to managing and overseeing and administering the CoC program funded project. Go to the next slide.
Real quick, Hope, sorry. I just wanted to take a step back to joint rapid rehousing, transitional housing. I misspoke about it being related to funding. It's actually related to units, not based on funding.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. So I want to briefly cover costs that the CoC program will not fund. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are costs that we get questions about frequently and maybe like common misconceptions about what the CoC program will fund. So HUD will not fund any costs related to building or operating an emergency shelter with CoC program funds, or any emergency shelter activities, except for those very specific emergency lodging costs associated with the rural budget line item. And then HUD will also not fund any temporary or standalone transitional housing projects. Again, with that exception and caveat of temporary housing offered under the rural budget line item. And it will not fund standalone transitional housing projects. So Dusty had spoke to the requirements of a joint component transitional and rapid rehousing project. And while that does create transitional housing and can offer transitional housing in connection to rapid rehousing, the primary focus of all projects funded under the CoC program is permanent housing and retention of permanent housing. So transitional housing cannot be the core focus of that project type, and it be eligible under this project. Additionally, I see a question about TH. That means transitional housing. So transitional housing by HUD's definition is the lease is in the name of the recipient or the agency receiving those funds. So the client is not building that rental history while they're enrolled in the project. And I see.
Yeah, if I
can
could, or just a
explain
second.
standalone.
Yeah, so I think what Kelly, if I could, I think I'm reading into Kelly's question. So in essence, you cannot request transitional housing by itself through the Continuum of Care program. Applicants and recipients of the Joint Component Project awards must be able to provide both the transitional housing and the rapid rehousing. So, for example, if we, as the Continuum of Care, receive an application that does not reflect sufficient rapid rehousing in connection to a transitional housing component, we would be compelled to reject that application if it does not meet the 2-to-1 ratio that Dusty was mentioning earlier. So standalone can literally mean, projects that don't offer permanent housing in connection to the transitional housing. It could also, for this purpose, mean, transitional housing and rapid rehousing projects that don't offer sufficient rapid rehousing. HUD's intent with the THRRH project is and will likely remain permanent housing as the focus rather than transitional housing. So I hope that answers the question, Kelly. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jim. I definitely misread your question, Kelly. So I think where I left off was homelessness prevention. So the CoC program will not fund any activities that are associated with homelessness prevention, which is generally emergency rental or utility assistance to keep folks in their home. So because the CoC program exclusively serves folks who are experiencing literal homelessness or Category 4 homelessness, where they're actively fleeing domestic violence or chronic homelessness, those definitions do not include any families that are at risk of homelessness, so at risk of eviction or living doubled up with another family, or otherwise don't meet HUD's definition of Category 1 or Category 4 homelessness. And then further, because all of these activities are not eligible under the CoC program, they are also not eligible as matching sources. So you cannot use any of these activities as a matching commitment in your request. And with that, I will pass it back off.
So thanks, Hope. In general, talking about who's eligible to administer CoC program funding, nonprofit organizations, state and local governments, instrumentalities of local governments, such as local mental health authorities and behavioral health authorities, Public housing authorities or public housing agencies are eligible to administer CoC program funding with some caveats. Applicants must be active in the System for Award Management or at sam.gov. They must have a unique entity identifier, formerly the DUNS number. Don't ask me what DUNS stands for. I can't remember anymore. It's I believe a 12-digit number that's assigned by the government to eligible entities. And then you, of course, must be eligible to do business in the state of Texas, so registered with the Secretary of State as an entity in the state of Texas. I hope kind of previously talked about this, but I think it's worth repeating. In order for a family or household or individual to be eligible to participate in the Continuum of Care program, individuals and families must qualify under Category 1 or Category 4 of HUD's homeless definition. Category 1 is, again, folks that are literally homeless, people sleeping in places not meant for human habitation, staying in emergency shelters, or otherwise lack of fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. Category 4, which is changing, but right now the definition that we're still using is an individual or family that is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, someone that has no other residence and lacks the resources or support networks to obtain other permanent housing. Talking in terms of like PSH and chronic homelessness, anyone that's experiencing chronic homelessness will qualify under Category 1. They may also be fleeing domestic violence, but their primary qualification would be Category 1 literal homelessness over a period of time that meets the chronic definition.
Hey, Jim, before we get too much farther on, Mike was asking, will the program cover staff to take time for the SOAR certification course?
You know, that's actually a really good question, Mike. I would need to do a little bit of research on that one. I know that you could bill the time actually with participants doing SOAR applications to the supportive service budget line. Whether or not you could pay for the certification associated, because it is rather lengthy. It's about 20 hours of training to become SOAR certified. I would need to circle back on that one. We'll talk about the FAQ here if we don't have an answer by the end of this webinar. I'm leaning towards probably not, but I want to verify that before I give you a firm answer. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Jim. So if you are a visual learner, this is kind of a quick overview of the various funding types and who is eligible to apply for those funding types in the Balance of State CoC, as well as what project types you can apply for. So just to walk through this quickly, so renewal project applications are limited to folks who are renewing an existing CoC program contract. So these are folks who are already operating a current CoC program and are wanting to renew that project this year. And then any new project applications will be submitted through either the CoC bonus or the Continuum of Care bonus or the domestic violence or DV bonus. So the CoC bonus is a little bit broader than the domestic violence bonus, but they fund mostly the same activities. The CoC bonus is open to anyone who is eligible to operate a CoC program and who meets the requirements in the NOFO and as defined in our request for proposals. So the project types that you can apply for under this opportunity are permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and then the joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing component. So these project types are intended to fund essentially not be specific to victims or survivors of domestic violence. You can request them here, but we do have a specific application pathway for folks who are seeking to primarily serve victims or survivors in their project. And that is through the domestic violence bonus. And we have limited that to victim service providers as defined by HUD, which is essentially any organization whose primary mission is to serve survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. These providers can also serve persons fleeing human trafficking, but they cannot exclusively target folks who are fleeing or attempting to flee human trafficking and still meet this definition. So the only difference between the domestic violence bonus and the CoC bonus in terms of eligible project types is that the domestic violence bonus does not fund permanent supportive housing. So if you're looking for that as an intervention, but are a victim service provider, you can consider applying under the CoC bonus. And I think the most important piece I want to highlight here is that we have limited new project applications to one new project per organization, meaning you have to, you cannot submit multiple new applications. You kind of have to narrow down which, if you're considering applying for multiple project types, narrow down the one that's the best fit for your community and your organization, and choose that as a path forward. Next slide, please. Perfect. So I already kind of dove into eligible costs on a previous slide, so I'm not going to hit every one of these in detail, but just kind of broadly speak to some things that I haven't mentioned in the previous slides. So each of the categories on the left-hand column is associated with a budget line item or a BLI that you will see in your eSynapse project application, and as well as SurveyMonkey. I would highly encourage you to read the regulations to better understand the activities that can be funded under each of these categories. But rental assistance, one thing I want to point out here is this funds not exclusively the rental assistance costs. This also funds any costs related to security deposits, staff time performing housing quality inspections, any staff time associated with essentially verifying the eligibility of the unit, so conducting a rent reasonableness study. Those costs aren't explicitly requested in your application, but they are eligible to draw down and request reimbursement for. But your rental assistance budget is based on essentially the number of units that you're requesting, multiplied by the FMR or fair market rent in your area. So you won't see a space to request security deposits, but that's kind of built into the budget. And rental assistance is associated generally with rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, whereas leasing is associated with transitional housing, specifically the transitional housing piece of a rapid rehousing or a joint rapid rehousing transitional housing project type. So that project type combines both rental assistance and leasing, so two different types of housing subsidies that each come with a little bit different requirements. So something important to consider here is that in transitional housing, the recipient of the funds, so the organization operating those funds, is the leaseholder. So the lease is between your organization and the property manager that you are leasing funds or leasing units from, and then you sublease those units to the participant. And then one other thing to add is that the leasing line is not subject to the match requirement, as are the other lines. Supportive services, I feel like I covered this in a previous slide. Again, would encourage you to read the regulations. This covers a broad range of categories and would encourage folks to really consider what supports a client might need to gain stability, and request costs associated with that. There's a pretty broad range of activities from food and groceries to childcare and general employment services, as well as like health and mental health services. So these are intended to help foster stability for folks exiting homelessness, and to be able to move them from a place of stability to housing retention on a long-term basis. Tracy, I see your question. I will circle back to that at the end of this slide. Admin costs are limited to 10% of your total budget request, and these are activities related to carrying out and managing the project. And then I spoke to VAWA cost and rural cost on a previous line. Wouldn't again encourage you to read the NOFO to better understand if you are, if your community or a community that you're proposing to serve meets the rural definition. And then again, HMIS costs are more than just the license and equipment fees. These are also any personnel and staff time related to HMIS data entry, running and analyzing reports for your project, and data evaluation. So I want to circle back to, I think there are a couple of questions in the chat related to budget line items. I see one from Tracy Andrus. The leasing line is not subject to match. That is correct. So the CoC program has a 25% match requirement. So project applicants are expected to match their budget request at 25%, and those matching activities have to be eligible under the CoC program, with the exception of the leasing line. So if you're requesting a joint transitional and rapid rehousing project, your total budget minus your leasing line will be subject to the 25% match requirement.
I could just clarify a little bit further. I think in this instance, like language is super important. What we may be thinking of in terms of leasing, HUD would actually consider to be rental assistance. So the specifics of the situation are definitely relevant. In general, I would say most of the time, projects are subject to a 25% match contribution for the entire budget, right? So if you submitted a $200,000 project, you should plan on a $50,000 match contribution. Again, the leasing line can kind of move that that overall percentage down a little bit if it's a significant portion of the grant application. But by and large, you know, folks should be planning for 25% of the total.
Thanks, Jim. I see another question. Can transportation count under supportive services? Yes. I'm going to put a link in the chat here in just a minute, and I think this may answer the next question as well about where you can find the regulations. There are eligible transportation costs under the supportive services line. These are things like mileage reimbursement for workers who are going out to do home visits and provide supportive services to clients. Public transportation is eligible, and then in limited circumstances, car repairs for clients are also eligible, in addition to some other transportation related cost. And then there's also a question about where we can find the regulations. I'm going to put a link to the CFR or Code of Federal Regulations for the Continuum of Care program in the chat. Subpart D will walk folks through the program components and eligible costs, and you can click on that link directly next to either supportive services or rental assistance or leasing, and so on, to better understand what exactly is eligible under the project. And I'm trying to see if there's any questions that I have missed.
Dr. Andrus, I think asked in the, well, no, I think Dr. Andrus asked a follow-up question. Where can I find the regulations regarding approved match activities? And that is a particularly tricky one. You will not find an exhaustive list of what is eligible to be used as match. In essence, any cost associated with an activity that is allowable under the grant might be eligible for use as match, depending on the source of that contribution. For example, if it's other federal funds, you could not use, you know, ESG rental assistance to match the CoC program, but you could use other types of rental assistance to match the CoC program. The tricky thing is that it has to comply to the letter with the the cost in the continuum of care program, even if you weren't awarded that cost. So the key distinction there being awarded and allowed. For example, under let me think here, the rental assist, let's just use the rental assistance line. You know, if you have a partnership with your public housing authority, and that public housing authority contributes a number of special purpose vouchers to the program to be used as either rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing, you could use those the cost of those vouchers as match. Similarly, like if you have a relationship with a licensed chemical dependency counselor who provides either one-on-one or group counseling to people with substance abuse disorder, the cost associated with providing those in-kind services could be used as match, even if you didn't request substance abuse treatment from HUD in your grant application. So that one is, again, particularly tricky. We're going to link to the FAQ or the CoC's FAQ, which I think has a little bit more on match. But yeah.
Jim.
And seeing a couple of other questions here.
Yeah, I saw Judy had asked about matching requirements. I know we didn't directly answer your specific question, but I feel like we may have indirectly answered it through another question. Judy, if you have any follow-up questions about match, feel free to put those in the chat.
So Gustavo asked a question, can we apply for several of the programs like PSH and the joint THRRH? If so, do we do an application for each? If we are renewing a rapid rehousing, would the other programs be new applications? So all applicants are limited to a single new project application. So you could apply for a new project if you're applying to renew an existing project. You cannot, however, combine the components on the previous slide here with one another in the same project application. So for example, you can't submit like a PSH and rapid rehousing project. It has to be either PSH or rapid or joint, or rapid or joint in the instance of domestic violence bonus. So I'm hopeful that helps. You will need to do a separate application for both renewal and new projects. We're going to get to that in the next couple of slides. I just want to make sure that we're staying on track because we do want to make sure we leave enough time for just general Q&A. Ginny, I see your question said that we can't use ESG. Is that new? There may be circumstances where you can use ESG, but in general, it's certainly not very common, and it has to meet specific requirements. So getting lost in the sauce on these questions here. Let's see. John Akers asked, we'll be renewing our PSH project. However, our agency is requesting we increase our supportive services budget. How could we modify our original HUD contract and or request newer line items under supportive? We shouldn't have to apply to CoC bonus. I'd like to address that one in the general Q&A if we can, John, because I think it's a good question and it's pretty relatively complicated. Shouldn't be, but like many things HUD related, it is. So I'm going to move us along. Keep the questions coming though. We're definitely trying to keep track of everything and make sure everyone gets an answer to their question. I wanted to take a second and talk about applicant requirements and project requirements. So all of the requirements for applicants from the continuum of care can be found in section 1D of the request for proposals. So, of course, applicants must meet all threshold and quality requirements in the NOFO. There are numerous references to threshold requirements in the NOFO. I would recommend keyword searching the word threshold for your reference. We do try to call out the most common ones, but certainly there are a number of kind of obscure threshold requirements. Such as if you have subrecipients, your subrecipients have to have a code of conduct. That's new for 2024. at least based on what I can find. So there's some obscure stuff in this NOFO. New in 2024 were the CoCs considering renewal replacement applications. So these are applications, again, described in the request for proposals. Renewal replacement applications are submitted by a renewal recipient to replace an existing renewal project. So essentially what happens is a renewal recipient or a renewal applicant would submit both their renewal project application and a new project application, would flag both of those projects as being part of a replacement application, and then we would use the score of the renewal project application to rank the new project application if it meets all of the threshold requirements. The important thing to understand here is that this does not result in a net increase to the project applicant. Project applicants are limited to the individual renewal amount or the annual renewal amount in Appendix A. So for example, if you have a $300,000 renewal project and it's just not working for you anymore and you want to try something a little bit different under the same component, maybe shuffle things around with your budget line items, this year you are able to do that. However, it is considered to be a form of reallocation, and so I think that it's important to understand there is some risk associated with this application type. Specifically, if the CoC does not score well on the CoC application, it could impact your ability to continue to operate the existing project or the new project, as it were. In the instance where a new project is selected in replacement of a renewal project, that renewal project will not be submitted as part of the CoC application. It's one or the other, right? Like if the new project doesn't meet threshold, we'll submit the renewal project. If the new project does meet threshold, we'll submit the new project, but not the renewal. Hopefully that's sufficiently confusing. Please consult the request for proposals. I was being sarcastic, by the way. I recognize people can't see my face right now, so I probably should have had my camera on for that statement. But there is significantly more detail in the request for proposals, and seeing it in writing, sometimes it reads a little bit different. So in 2024, new project applicants must not have any open monitoring findings with HUD. This is not new. This has been a requirement since 2022 in the Continuum of Care program for the Texas Balance Estate. Essentially, it means exactly what it says. If a project applicant, either new or renewal, has open monitoring findings with HUD, they are limited to submission of the renewal project only. Of course, applicants must propose eligible activities. And then talking more specifically about the DV bonus application or funding pool, applicants must use both a comparable database and be a victim service provider as defined by HUD. Hope, I think, touched on that a minute earlier or a few minutes ago in terms of the agency's primary mission must be to support survivors of domestic violence. That same agency may not, however, target survivors of human trafficking as explicitly or singularly, right? Like if that's part of a larger target of people experiencing domestic violence, that is allowable. Again, if the agency's primary mission is to support survivors of human trafficking per the NOFO, they are not eligible under that pool of funding. Application requirements, this is significant. Again, we're looking at request for proposal section 1D. There are other application requirements. These are the ones that we thought were most important to share in this space. I would highly encourage applicants to read section 1D and understand it and ask questions if you don't. Essentially, the minimum project application budget is $200,000. The maximum this year, up from 2023, is $1 million. Applicants are limited to a single or one new project application per organization. And this kind of goes to the next one, goes to a question in the chat. Applicants must propose to serve BOS counties exclusively. So if you border on another continuum of care and are working in, Houston or Austin or Fort Worth, and are trying to expand your services out to, Denton or Hayes or wherever, one, we welcome you into the BOS. At the same time, we want these funds to stay in the balance of state. So we're excluding counties from another continuum of care. So if you intend to serve participants in Fort Worth, for example, or Houston or Austin, you cannot use these funds to do that. Again, for 2023, no construction, acquisition, or rehabilitation, or any variation of those activities. Application budgets must be no more than 50% of the most recently approved agency budget. So what that means is if you request a $1 million project, you must have an approved $2 million budget to demonstrate sufficient capacity to administer the project. Housing case management is required. We're really looking for folks to support the continuum of needs that people present with, right? In essence, rental assistance is likely not enough to help people resolve their episode of housing instability or homelessness. We really want to see that folks are considering their full range of needs and working to meet those. HMIS costs or Homeless Management Information System costs are capped at 3% of the request or $15,000, whichever is less. There is and this kind of goes back to Dusty's statement previously, there is a 2-to-1 service to housing ratio. So what that means is if you are requesting $100,000 in rental assistance, you can request no more than $200,000 in supportive services. There is also a 2-to-1 ratio for rapid rehousing to transitional housing in a joint component project application. And then finally, new projects must score 70% or higher for that project type for inclusion in the priority listing. In essence, if a project scores a 68% on a 100-point scale, they would not be eligible for inclusion. I want to talk a little bit about the timeline, and I see that there are some chats stacking up. I'm not actually seeing them. I'm going to just pause for a second and see. William, yes, what I'm talking about right now, William, is for new projects specifically. And our budget request for a single year or for the whole 2-year grant period. So that's a really good question, Mike. So HUD is awarding these as single year grants, right? So in essence, if a project is conditionally awarded in the 2024 grant application process, HUD will, in essence, automatically renew that grant application for 2025. So you will not be submitting a 2-year budget. You will submit a single year budget, and the conditions on the previous screen would apply to that single year. Sean Griffin is asking, what is the budget threshold for a new project if it is a new agency, i.e. no previously approved agency budget? Again, great question. We are looking for applicants to demonstrate that they have experience in this space before they access CoC program funds. So, we don't need to demonstrate, 10 years of experience, but the continuum of care program and our experience is not the federal program to learn on. We want to see, again, some demonstrated capacity over the last year. So in going into the timeline, I think this is important. This is not the entirety of the timeline from the request for proposals. I just want to be really clear about that. We pulled out the part that we thought would be most relevant to project applicants, but know that there are another 10 or so steps after step 14 here. But again, we issued the RFP yesterday. The intent to apply opened yesterday at 9 a.m. The full application opened and apply at noon. And then the intent to apply stage will close and apply on 8/21 at 4:59 p.m. So essentially by the close of business on 8/21, applicants will need to have made a decision about whether or not they plan to apply in 2024, both new and renewal. Once an applicant submits their intent to apply, during this period, there is an initial threshold review where staff review basic project details and basic agency eligibility stuff, such as do you have an active SAM registration? Do you have an active UEI number that that correlates to the agency applying? Are the preliminary project details in line with what the continuum of care program will fund? That threshold review can take anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. So, we encourage folks to consider, as they're submitting their intent to apply, building that into their application submission timeline. They typically don't take all that long. They're relatively straightforward, especially for renewal projects. Renewal projects are very straightforward as far as threshold reviews. The full application stage will close and apply on September the 3rd, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. So in essence, all application materials are due by September the 3rd. I apologize for the closeness to Labor Day. It's obviously not ideal. Congress and HUD force us to do this on an annual basis and don't tell us the time. So it's pretty challenging to budget staff resources around. But we are looking for applications to be submitted by the 3rd at midnight. We'll then complete a completeness and quality review. So THN staff will review each application to ensure that the documents submitted are responsive to the prompts, that the activities proposed are allowable, and will then pass those applications on to the independent review team. The independent review team will begin new project reviews on September the 7th. And complete those reviews on September the 15th at midnight. We'll make those application scores available the very next day on the 16th, and we'll reconcile application scoring no later than the following day at noon. Once we have reconciled scores for new and renewal projects, we will complete the ranking scenarios for board review and approval. All this comes from the CoC's competition policies, which are up on the website, the competition page now. But essentially, the board is the entity that makes the decision about ranking, order, and submission. So that process occurs on September 20th. And then the board will select a ranking scenario on September the 25th. And then we'll make that review or that ranking public the following day. I skipped over step 13. So applicants are able to request extensions to non-scored components of the application, specifically the eSNAPS project application and the certification of consistency. Both of those are non-scored application components, so they will not affect an applicant's score in this process, but are required for successful submission to HUD. In other words, we cannot submit an application that lacks either one of those two things. And so we are allowing folks additional time if they follow the prompts to request an extension in both the RFP and Appendix B. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Billy.
Yeah, go to the next slide, Jim. So these charts that you're seeing, the timeline that Jim just went through, as well as these that you're about to see here, these are charts that we pulled directly out of the request for proposal. And so you can be able to go in there and see these again. They're there. So this part, we want to kind of just let you see the structure of the applications. Now I can go into detail about each one of the stages, because you can actually go to Appendix B within the request for proposal that will provide detailed descriptions for each one of these stages. But you kind of have two parts to the full application process, which is the intent to apply and the full application. And so you can see here in these charts, this first one here, we're looking at new projects. And so this is the CoC bonus and the DV bonus applications. The intent to apply has 5 stages to it. When we say stages, this means that each one of these stages you will be submitting individually throughout the process. And so you will not have submitted the entire intent to apply section until you have submitted each of the 5 stages within the intent to apply. So that's the entity eligibility, charity verification, agency details, preliminary project details, and acknowledgements. And so again, in Appendix B, you can see the detailed descriptions for each one of those stages, but you'll have to individually submit each one of those stages to complete the intent to apply section. The due date for intent to apply, you'll see there, the deadline for it is August 21st, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. So beyond that time, that deadline, we will not be accepting any further application submissions. And so if you want to be able to get an application into the ring for CoC funding this year, then you need to be sure to get your intent to apply in prior to that deadline of October 21st, 2024. And then once you've completed that and have gotten through the threshold review stage and have been seen as eligible to continue to apply in the process, you will then be able to move into the full application part of the application process. And so you'll see there are 7 stages to that, being project details, agency capacity, financial management and administration, budget table, component specific questions, monitoring history report, and then the required file uploads. You do not have to complete each one of the stages in order necessarily, but you do have to submit every stage to be able to complete the application and get the full submission in. We do recommend getting started as soon as possible on the eSNAPS portion of the application and some of the external parts outside of this table that you're seeing, so that you can be able to meet that deadline. So you'll see for full application, the deadline is September 3rd, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. So this table here is for the new project applications. And if we go to the next slide, you see for the renewal projects. Oh, there you go. Yeah, so for renewal projects, kind of similar structure that you can see there with the table. For the intent to apply, I believe it's basically the same 5 stages as new, except a little bit different, because for renewals, you're used to continuing care expectations. And so acknowledgements, continuing care expectations looks a little bit different. We have your entity eligibility, charity verification, agency details, continuing care expectations, and project details as the 5 stages that are due by the deadline of August 21st, 2024 for the intent to apply. And then for the full application, same as new applications, the deadline is September 3rd, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. And you have 8 stages within the renewal project application, full application section. And that's the renewal project questions, monitoring history report, eSNAPS applicant profile, letters of support, match documentation, the eSNAPS project application, certification of consistency with the consolidated plan, and then the subrecipient code of conduct. This part is optional because and we don't go into too much detail because this does not apply to a whole lot of people, but if you do have subrecipients, there is a little bit more emphasis this year by HUD to kind of provide the eligibility for the subrecipients and verify the eligibility for subrecipients. And so if you do have subrecipients, that code of conduct will be highly and strongly recommended to upload in your application. And you'll see details along the format to kind of help you see. Sometimes, even if it only says apply, there may still be uploads that will be called for and asked for throughout a particular stage. Like for renewals, for the renewal project questions, you will see that there are uploads that we'll be asking for. So just because you don't see in this table that it doesn't say uploads, that's why it's very important to reference Appendix B, get very familiar with Appendix B, and be prepared to go back to it, because it will help you kind of through the entire process to have detailed descriptions for every stage.
Okay, so the Texas Balance the State CoC priorities for this year is community-wide commitment, leveraging housing or healthcare resources, so working in partnerships with local agencies in the community, landlord engagement strategies, SOAR trained staff, and or other benefit specialists. These are individuals who are primarily focused on providing these resources to individuals. Housing first, targeting the hardest to serve. Persons with lived experience of homelessness must meaningfully contribute to project design and implementation, as well as targeting underserved communities, which varies by community. I am going to put in the chat a bit more of an explanation on each one of these. That's also linked in the PowerPoint that Billy sent to everyone in the chat, but it's also on our website as well. If we go to the next slide, please. So the 2024-2025 HUD homelessness policy priorities are ending homelessness for all persons, using a housing first approach, reducing unsheltered homelessness, improving system performance, partnering with housing, health, and service agencies, racial equity, improving assistance to LGBTQ+, having individuals with lived experiences providing input, building an effective workforce, and increasing affordable housing supply.
Thanks, Dusty. So I want to do just a little bit deeper dive on housing first, because that is a priority for both the balance of state and for HUD. And if I can just expand on the importance of our priorities that Dusty spoke to. The reason those priorities are important is that we expect project applicants to align with or advance at least one or more of our balance of state priorities in their proposed project. So there, if you look at the RFP, there is a connection between some of our priorities and scored elements of the project type. So we're not telling you that for nothing. Those are clues for how you might score well in the project by aligning with or demonstrating alignment with our CoC program priorities. But speaking briefly to housing first, again, this is a priority of both HUD and the CoC. Additionally, and it's also a requirement to utilize a housing first approach within the delivery of your project and design of your CoC program funded project. I have a feeling most folks are at least generally familiar with housing first as a requirement, but it's essentially a low barrier approach to programming and service delivery and retention of programming. So folks are screened into the project rather than screened out. And there are few to no programmatic requirements to gain or maintain permanent housing. So this means that folks can't be screened out for things like having no income or using substances or not engaging in supportive services or mental health or healthcare. Those are all things that can be offered through supportive services, but cannot be used as a basis for screening someone out or terminating someone from the project. It is housing first. It's not housing only or housing forever. So projects should be offering a broad range of supportive services that are intended to meet the needs of the folks that they're serving and help foster stability for that individual based on their unique needs. But those supportive services are offered on a voluntary basis, where case managers are routinely engaging participants to ensure that their supportive services and housing needs are being met, but that participants aren't being terminated from the project for not engaging in those supportive services. and that the project implements practices and policies and processes that help prevent lease violations and evictions, and that those occurrences alone aren't a reason for project termination. And then further within a Housing First project, participants have full rights, responsibilities, and legal protections under the law as they would a tenant in any other housing unit.
Yes, and so next steps, I'll be real brief going through these steps because I just put a link of the presentation slides in the chat again, and so you can be able to get these and should be able to access all of these links that you can see on this slide. But go ahead and get as familiar as possible with the request for proposals, read through it, make it handy, bookmark it, print it out if you need to, make notes, whatever you need to do, but get familiar with the request for proposals. Submit to apply by August 21st. Sign up for our competition updates, and you'll see the link right there, right directly in the slide. And so if you haven't already signed up for that, do so as soon as possible. Monitor and pay attention to our CoC competition landing page, because we will continue throughout the entire process to put updates up and documents and just different resources that you will need to help you get through the process. Update your organization's SAM registration as soon as possible if you have not yet, so that you can prevent any delays through your application process. And create and update your organization's eSNAPS applicant profile. The sooner the better, as soon as you can get into the eSNAPS process. And then review HUD resources on the CoC program. There's never a lack of things to read through this program to become more familiar with it.
Yeah, I would say the one great thing about the well, there's a number of great things about the Continuum of Care program, but in general, it is very well documented on the HUD Exchange. Those resources are invaluable to kind of learn more about, what this journey that you're embarking on can do. So I know we have about 14 minutes remaining. We wanted to save some time for questions and answers. I wanted to go back quickly to John's question. If a renewal applicant is interested in increasing their budget this year, they will need to submit a new project application. There is no pathway for a renewal applicant to expand their project application in 2024. Instead, an applicant would need to submit a new project application that meets all of the threshold requirements for new projects, and then consolidate those grants or those awards in a future funding cycle if both the renewal and the new are selected for conditional award. So I know in the past we've had avenues for folks to expand their CoC funded renewal projects. This year we are asking folks to submit new projects and then combine them later on in the process. I will say, and I know we have some folks on here who have done that in the past. The consolidation process is a non-competitive process, so there's no like hidden second step that you'll have to go through. It's essentially you submit a new project, you'll have your own, its own contract terms, contract start and end date, and then once you consolidate that project, that all becomes one. So hopefully that answers the question, John. I see a thumb, so great. What I recognize that this may be like drinking from a fire hose if you have not participated in this process, or even if you have participated in this process before. But we wanted to save some time for questions and answers, so I'm going to stop talking and let folks put them in the chat if they have them. Yeah, so Mike, that the reference that you're talking about is specific to rapid rehousing. So Mike says, on the HUD Exchange, they state that program participants are required to meet with a case manager at least once a month and should have access to a broad array of additional services to help them maintain housing. That makes it sound like case management is required, but per Housing First, we can't make it a requirement. So how does that work? So I think in terms of like the mindset that you're approaching your case management and supportive services with, right? Like we're not interested in warehousing people, right? Like folks will, are compelled to have some engagement with supportive service staff, right? Like you can't just pay rental assistance for a unit if you don't know who's living in there, or, you don't even know if the participant is even still in town. Maybe they, you know, wherever, maybe they went up to the Pacific Northwest to cool off a little bit, or who knows, right? So there is some kind of base level engagement that we are expecting folks to have with their participants. That is different, and having access to the broader array of supportive services at all times, right? That is different than saying to a participant, in order to maintain your housing, you have to engage with me on this, and this, and that's just the end of that. And then if they don't do it, they get 3 warnings and then they're out. Again, Housing First is not housing only. And it's not, I liked how Hope said it, it's not housing no matter what, right? Like folks are expected to maintain their unit the same way that someone from the private market would be able to. That said, it is not uncommon to rehouse folks, 2 or sometimes more times before it just kind of clicks. And then sometimes for folks it just doesn't click with that program or that opportunity, and it just doesn't work. So again, I think like when you're thinking about case management, supportive services, how all that like meshes with like meeting the requirements of the program to engage folks. I mean, we're talking about rapid rehousing. They have 24 months to stabilize. So there has to be some kind of ongoing engagement. It should, however, be participant driven, if that makes sense. Meredith asks, do expansion applications have to meet the $200,000 minimum application amount? Yes, they do have to meet that. So again, expansion applications are not solicited through this process. Applicants that are intending to expand an application would need to submit a new project application and then consolidate those applications on the back end non-competitively if both are awarded. Tracy Andrus asks, who do I send the intent to apply to? That's a great question, Dr. Andrus. I want to take us back to the slides here real quick. Everything that you were asking is solicited through the SurveyMonkey Apply portal. So you will submit your intent to apply through SurveyMonkey Apply. You do not need to like email anything to us or declare your intent in any kind of formal fashion. We are submitting the first stage of the the first several stages 1 through 5 here on your screen at the top there under intent to apply. That signals your intent to apply. Erica is asking, as we plan for fund development, what's a reasonable estimated start date that project activities could be funded by this grant? Oh, what a fantastic question. So this HUD is notoriously slow, right? So the timeline from here is, we're soliciting these applications. If a project is selected for recommendation to HUD, we will make that recommendation no later than October the 30th. That recommendation then goes through their threshold quality and scoring process, which can take quite a while. I've seen it take, 6 to 9 months. So realistically, we would be looking for projects that are conditionally awarded to be notified of that award in the spring of 2025. And then the amount of time that it takes for a project to satisfy the issues and conditions varies, right? It could be 3 months, it could be 6 months, it could be 9 months, it could be irreconcilable and it just doesn't happen. I think a reasonable start date for a project that is conditionally awarded would be sometime in the summer or fall of 2025. Andrea asks, if we are renewing and want to reallocate funds in the budget to other budget line items, the same amount as our last project, we are renewing or doing a new application? That is a good question. So if you are submitting a renewal project application and want to, for example, add funds to the VAWA compliance budget line item that you didn't already have, you can move up to 10% of another budget line item into a budget line item without triggering a significant amendment. You cannot significantly amend or, change the target population or move budget line items around more than 10% through this process. Submitting a new application is literally just that. It is for new activities in addition to what you're renewing. I wanted to just flag that, after folks in this call, the slide 29, those are all links in slide 29 that we would recommend folks bookmarking and asking questions about. If you do have specific questions, please don't email me directly or Billy directly. Email TXBOSCOC@THN.org. THN.org. That mailbox is monitored by this entire team and will get you the fastest response. If you've emailed me in the last couple of weeks, you've probably seen an auto reply that says that, delayed responses are likely. It is very likely if you email me, it may get lost for, more time than it should. Also on this slide, we wanted to point out the frequently asked questions. So it's possible that the answer to your question is already, documented. Please check out the frequently asked questions. We are going to continuously update that throughout this process as we get questions via email or, as we kind of hear and learn new things. So we would highly recommend bookmarking that BOS frequently asked questions document. Is there anything else that I've missed? I'm looking at Dusty, Billy, Hope, Craig. Anything you feel like is important to speak on?
We will have this recording put to our YouTube by the end of the day. We will also
Yes.
send out all the materials to everybody that registered and maybe that didn't attend. That's all I got.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. Yeah, the recording will go up via YouTube. It'll also be linked on our competition landing page. Well, we can stick around for a few more minutes in case there are any additional questions. But if there are no questions, you are free to go. I do see another question in the chat. However, Erica is asking, would this be the place to confirm which areas count as rural? If you got that from the 2024 competition landing page
That's the
on
2023 one.
HUD.gov, it's very likely that they're the same geographies for 2024. I'll tell you that they're probably not adding any in terms of like rural. I'm pulling up the Texas geocodes right now. And most of them are in the balance of state. So you can see like Andrews County, Angelina County. There's a few. So I would say that's a pretty good starting place. But again, monitoring the HUD.gov for updates to that. They will update their competition landing page regularly and without notice. So I check it daily just to make sure we're not missing anything. and would recommend that, anyone interested do the same.
And I'm seeing, Jim, that link that Eric has shared is that rural area geocode report link underneath FY24. That is, it's the same thing. So it looks like that is pretty safe to assume that that would be what you could be looking at, because it is under
The
the
only thing that's throwing me off, Billy, is that in the URL, it does flag it as the FY23, but again,
I
it's
tried
very
changing that to
unlikely.
4 and it went to a dead page.
Yeah, it's very unlikely that they're adding any geography, and I think it's probably pretty safe to assume that they are sticking with the existing geography, but we will check it whenever the applications are submitted. So Jenny's asking another question here in the chat. I need help in figuring out the 10% allowable budget changes. Yeah, good question, Jenny. Sometimes I feel like I need help figuring out it as well. In essence, like it's for the purpose of them allowing that this year is to create funds in that VAWA budget line. So as a renewal project without any action, your 2024 contract is going to have a VAWA budget line. It's going to be zeroed out by default. You can move money into that VAWA budget line without triggering a significant amendment if it is less than 10% of the budget line item that it's moving from. So for example, for you guys, like if your supportive service budget line, you want to move, 10% of the supportive service budget line, you can do that without triggering a significant amendment. The issue is if you exceed 10%, then of course you trigger all that other stuff. Does that answer the question, Jenny? Yeah, so I would refer you to the NOFO itself. Let me see here. Let's see if I can find you an exact reference here. So this is in the citation that was linked in the presentation 43BA2. Sorry, 4AB2, section 3. I realize I'm not actually sharing. There we go. You can move, you can add VAWA to eligible renewal projects by shifting up to 10% of funds from one eligible activity to the VAWA cost line item. I believe there's another reference to, allowing you as a renewal recipient can change. This is, now I will say it is a request, right? It's not a guarantee that your field office will approve it, but you can move up to 10% of funds from one approved eligible activity to another through the renewal process without a significant amendment. Yes, Jenny, you can. So Jenny is asking, we only get 3.5% for admin, which is unreal. Can we move some leasing into admin? Yes, you can. Again, the considerations are you cannot exceed 10%. So I see your question, Daisy. Hang on a second. So you cannot exceed 10% for admin, and you cannot exceed 10% from the budget line you're moving from to into admin. but you can move leasing into admin. Another consideration is that it will increase your match contribution nominally, presumably, but it will affect your match contribution. So you'll need to make some changes on the summary budget screen for sure, or on the budget screens for sure. So the 10% that Jenny is asking about is different from the 10% BLI change allowed. Yes, both are allowed, Daisy. So if you I have identified a need to move funds within budget line items, you can move up to 10% of one budget line item to another. At the same time, you can also move up to 10% of one budget line item to the VAWA budget line, which will be zeroed out by default. So you already have a VAWA budget line, even though you didn't, or actually, I can't recall the specifics of your application, but I don't believe you requested VAWA compliance costs. So even though you haven't previously, it's already there and you can do that through the renewal process. All that is done in eSnaps. I mean, it's not an increase, right? So you're just shuffling money around, but essentially, yes. You can typically you could only do one, right? Like you could only do up to 10% of one budget line item to another, but through the competition, you can do 10% from one budget line to another, and then 10% to the VAWA budget line. Again, yeah, I think you and Jenny are out of the same field office, so it is subject to HUD review and approval. So if they reject it, it will default to what it was on the GIW. Great questions. I wish it was more clear. I see we have a handful of other folks on this call. If there's any other questions, you know, we can stick around for another couple minutes. Again, txboscoc@thn.org is probably going to be your best bet to get, you know, written guidance from us. Absolutely. Thanks, Daisy. All right. Well, I think we can shut this down. Thank everyone so much for your time and attention. You know, there's a lot of things you could be doing today, and you chose to spend some time with us. So we're grateful for that. And let us know if there's anything that we can do to help.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.